The world was on the edge. With every passing hour, Earth's fate seemed more certain. The Zeltar Empire, a ruthless alien force that had ravaged hundreds of worlds, had turned their sights on humanity. They were known for their brutal efficiency, their vast war machines, and their unwavering desire for control. Across the galaxy, whispers of their next conquest were spreading. Earth was next. Dr. Sarah Holt stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring down at the massive, glowing core beneath the surface of the planet. The project, once deemed a pipe dream by her peers, was now their last hope. Hidden deep in Earth's mantle was an ancient relic, a forge older than anything known to humanity, a forge capable of creating weapons unlike anything seen in the galaxy. She had uncovered the forge's existence by sheer accident, a forgotten artifact buried in the planet's deepest layers. And now it was Earth's only chance for survival. But as the lead scientist of this groundbreaking operation, Dr. Holt's discovery was met with skepticism from her own government. Many were reluctant to trust such an unproven weapon, especially one whose origins were shrouded in mystery. They were desperate, yes, but the uncertainty of wielding such power was a dangerous gamble. Even worse, there were rumors of factions within Earth's own government who viewed the power of the forge as a means of domination, not just defense. The divide was palpable, and trust was slipping through her fingers like sand. Dr. Holt, a voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see her second-in-command, Captain Leo Grayson, walking toward her. His face was etched with concern, the weight of the situation clear in his eyes. "The Zeltar fleet is closer. We have weeks, maybe less, before they reach Earth's atmosphere. We need to make a decision." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the ancient technology before her. This was it. This was the moment that would define humanity's future. The Eternal Forge was their last, best hope, but how could she trust it? It was a relic, old, mysterious, and unstable. No one knew its true potential. It could either turn the tide in their favor or rip their world apart. "We can't afford hesitation," Sarah said finally, her voice unwavering. "The forge is our only shot. If we can unlock its power in time, it could be the weapon we need to fight back. But we need to act quickly." Grayson nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "And if it fails?" "If it fails," he replied, meeting his gaze, "then we die, just like everyone else." The team of engineers and scientists under Sarah's leadership began their work. As the excavation team drilled deeper into the Earth's crust to expose more of the forge, Dr. Holt could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. She had spent years studying ancient technologies, trying to unlock the secrets of forgotten civilizations. But this was different. It wasn't just about solving a scientific mystery. It was about saving the future of every human alive. The ground trembled beneath them as the power from the forge began to hum, its energy slowly awakening. The ancient structure, once dormant for millennia, was responding to their efforts. But with every passing second, Sarah felt the unease growing. Something didn't feel right. The closer they got to unlocking the forge's secrets, the more powerful the hum became, almost as if the forge itself was alive, aware of what was happening. A voice crackled through her comm device, interrupting her thoughts. "Dr. Holt, we've encountered something unexpected. We've got readings, massive energy spikes coming from underground. It's not from the forge. Something else is down here." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What else?" "We don't know yet," the voice replied, "but it's massive." The ground shook violently, and for a split second, Dr. Holt feared they had triggered a cataclysm. But then the tremors subsided, and the hum from the forge grew even louder, more insistent. It was as though the planet itself had started to wake, responding to their intrusion. "We need to pull back," Grayson warned, his voice urgent. "This isn't right." But Sarah, driven by the pressure of time and the enormity of the task before her, shook her head. "No, we're too close." Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but she couldn't afford to stop now. Not when humanity's survival hung in the balance. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that they were not the only ones searching for the power of the forge. The days that followed the discovery of the unknown energy spikes were nothing short of chaos. Dr. Sarah Holt and her team pushed forward, determined to unlock the secrets of the Eternal Forge. But as they worked tirelessly, something ominous loomed over them, something far more dangerous than the Zeltar Empire. In the midst of their efforts, strange things began happening. The lights flickered erratically in the underground base, and odd malfunctions in their equipment became frequent. The forge hummed with increasing intensity, as though it was responding to the mounting pressure. But the unsettling feeling that something was off became harder to ignore. It all came to a head when, in the dead of night, the facility's perimeter alarms blared to life. Sarah was in her lab, reviewing the latest scans of the forge, when the shrill sound of the siren pierced the quiet. "What's going on?" she asked, rushing to the communications panel. "Unauthorized breach detected," came the reply from the security team. "Multiple intruders are inside the facility. We have confirmation. Mercenaries." Sarah's heart raced. The thought that mercenaries had somehow infiltrated their base sent a wave of dread through her. But it wasn't just their lives at risk. The Eternal Forge, still untested, was too dangerous for anyone to handle, especially outsiders with unknown motives. If the mercenaries seized control of it, there was no telling what kind of destruction they could unleash. "Lock down the facility. No one gets in or out," Sarah commanded, her voice sharp. She grabbed a weapon from the storage locker and ran toward the control room, her mind racing. By the time she reached the command center, the base was in full lockdown. The mercenaries had already breached the outer perimeter, cutting through security with frightening efficiency. But even more troubling were the signs that these attackers were no ordinary mercenaries. Their movements were too organized, too precise. They had intel, inside intel. "Dr. Holt, we've got a problem." Grayson's voice crackled through the comms. "The mercenaries aren't the only threat. We've identified a traitor on the inside." Sarah froze, her stomach dropping. "Who?" "Lieutenant Carter. He's been feeding them information about the forge's location. The mercenaries were expecting us to try and activate it. They knew exactly where to go." "How long have you known?" Sarah's voice was icy. Grayson hesitated, the weight of the confession clear in his tone. "I didn't know until now. But I've been watching Carter for a while. I didn't want to believe it." Her mind raced, every detail of the past few weeks flashing through her mind. Carter had been one of the first to volunteer for the project. His loyalty had never been in question, until now. "We need to stop him, Grayson," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We can't let him or anyone else sabotage this." But as they prepared to secure Carter's location, the situation grew worse. The mercenaries, led by an enigmatic figure known only as Viper, had already infiltrated the deepest sections of the base. They were closing in on the forge itself, intent on seizing control. "We don't have time to hunt down Carter," Grayson said, urgency in his voice. "The mercenaries are already in the forge chamber." Sarah's heart pounded. The thought of allowing those mercenaries to get their hands on the Eternal Forge was unthinkable. But she also couldn't afford to let Carter slip away. He was the only one who knew how deep the conspiracy ran. She had to make a choice. Secure Carter first. "I'll handle the mercenaries," she ordered, her voice firm. The decision weighed heavily on her, but it was clear there was no room for hesitation. If she didn't act now, everything they had worked for would be lost. The fate of humanity, and the weapon they had just begun to understand, was in her hands. As she made her way toward the forge chamber, her thoughts were clouded by the realization that she might be running out of time. The Zeltar were still advancing, and with every passing moment, they grew closer to Earth's atmosphere. Soon, the mercenaries would be joined by something far more terrifying. Something that had been waiting for this exact moment. With one final look at the monitors, Sarah steeled herself. They were not just fighting for Earth anymore. They were fighting for the future itself. The forge chamber was cold, its vast walls lined with ancient, alien inscriptions that flickered in the dim light. Sarah's boots echoed on the steel floor as she moved swiftly toward the heart of the room, where the eternal forge lay dormant, its power only a whisper of energy waiting to be awakened. The mercenaries had breached the outer sanctum, but the real threat was not their weapons. It was the power contained within the forge itself. And if they activated it, there was no telling what chaos would follow. Sarah's fingers brushed against the control panel, the complex interface a labyrinth of unknown symbols. She had spent months studying the forge's intricacies, but every time she thought she had unlocked its secrets, another layer of complexity revealed itself. Her pulse quickened as she tried to override the system, but the mechanism resisted her efforts. Something was wrong. "Sarah, we've got a situation." Grayson's voice crackled over the comms. "Carter's been located." But what?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp as she continued to study the panel. "But it's too late. He's dead. The mercenaries got to him first." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Carter had been the key. He knew the location of the forge's central core, the critical part of the mechanism that controlled its power. Without him, they were flying blind, unable to make sense of the technology that could either save them or destroy everything. "Do we have a lock on the mercenaries?" she demanded, not allowing herself to dwell on the loss of one more person. They were at war now, and every second counted. "We've got a few down, but Viper's still alive and in the main control room. He's holding the team at bay. We need backup, or we'll lose it all." "Keep holding them off," Sarah said, her voice now laced with determination. "I'll handle the forge." With a final push of a sequence of commands, the forge flickered to life. Energy surged through the room, lighting up the inscriptions on the walls, bathing the chamber in an eerie glow. The humming sound intensified, vibrating through the floor, the air heavy with ancient power. For a brief moment, it felt as though the forge was alive, its pulse synchronized with her own heart, as though it could sense her desperation, her need to unlock its potential. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to push deeper into its core. As she reached for the central control node, a low voice sounded from behind her, cold and calculated. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, Dr. Holt?" Sarah's heart sank, and she spun to face the source of the voice. Viper. Tall, armored, and with an icy smirk that betrayed his confidence, he stood there, holding a weapon aimed directly at her. Behind him, a team of mercenaries had surrounded the room, cutting off any chance of escape. "You shouldn't have come here," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Viper chuckled darkly, the sound reverberating off the chamber walls. "Oh, I understand perfectly. This forge is the key to everything. It's the weapon that will finally make us masters of this galaxy. And you," he pointed at her, "you're just a means to an end." Sarah took a slow step backward, her mind racing. The forge was her responsibility, but now Viper had control. Her every instinct screamed that he needed to be stopped. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not when the fate of Earth, and every living being in the galaxy, rested on the power of this ancient weapon. The mercenaries were closing in, their eyes gleaming with the same greed that had driven them to this point. Viper's expression darkened, a promise of violence hanging in the air. "You know, Dr. Holt," he said, lowering his weapon slightly, "you could have joined us. We could have ruled the galaxy together." "Not with you," she snapped back, her mind working furiously to find a way out. Suddenly, the forge's hum reached a fever pitch, the ground beneath their feet trembling as the structure began to react to the presence of multiple life forms. Sarah's heart raced. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. "Get away from the forge," she shouted, hoping to distract him. She reached for the nearby console, fingers flying over the controls in desperation. The energy spikes from earlier were escalating. If she could just. Without warning, the chamber shook violently. The forge had awakened fully, its power surging, responding to the activation sequence Sarah had triggered. A massive pulse of energy erupted from the core, blasting the mercenaries back, throwing them off their feet. The room was filled with light, blinding and all-consuming. In the heart of the chaos, Sarah's last thought was that they had just unleashed something far greater than any of them had anticipated. The chamber was engulfed in light, the pulse of energy from the eternal forge blasting outward like a cosmic shockwave. Sarah shielded her eyes, her body pushed back against the force, her breath stolen by the intensity of the surge. The ground trembled beneath her, as though the very foundation of the base was being torn apart. The mercenaries, thrown by the sheer force of the energy, were scattered across the room, their bodies thrown against the walls and equipment. For a long, deafening moment, nothing could be heard except the low hum of the forge's core, its power now fully unleashed. Slowly, the blinding light began to fade, leaving behind a room filled with chaos. The air was thick with the scent of burnt circuits and ozone. Sparks flew from broken consoles, and the walls seemed to pulse with residual energy from the forge's awakening. Sarah's hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the floor, wiping the sweat from her brow. The overwhelming power of the forge was still humming in her veins, a constant presence that both terrified and exhilarated her. She turned to see the mercenaries slowly rising to their feet, but Viper was nowhere to be seen. In his place, one of his men was sprawled motionless on the floor, unconscious, or worse. Grayson's voice crackled through her comms, bringing her back to reality. "Sarah, report. What happened in there?" "I activated the forge," she said, her voice strained but resolute. "It's alive, but there's no telling what we've just unleashed. It's too much." "What do you mean, too much?" Grayson asked, his voice tight with concern. "Is it under control?" "No," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. "It's not under control, but I think I've just created a weapon that could end this war, if we can learn to wield it." Before Grayson could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the chamber. Sarah's eyes snapped to the source of the noise. Viper. He had regained consciousness and was slowly standing up, shaking off the effects of the energy blast. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won, Holt?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "You've only just begun to understand the power of the forge, but you've made a mistake. You've given me everything I need." With a growl, Viper pulled out a small device from his jacket and pressed a button. The forge pulsed again, but this time it was different. The hum became more erratic, almost angry, as though the device was interfering with the forge's delicate balance. Sarah's stomach churned. "No," she shouted, rushing toward the central control console. "He's trying to take control of it." Viper grinned, watching her panic. "You think you can control it?" "No, Dr. Holt. The forge is mine now." With a sickening lurch, the chamber began to tremble once more. The walls cracked, and the forge's power surged, now spiraling out of control. Sarah's mind raced. The energy was escalating too quickly. If they didn't shut it down, it would tear the entire base apart. She rushed toward the central console, her fingers flying over the controls, but the system was locked. Viper had activated a failsafe, blocking all attempts to deactivate the forge. "Grayson!" Sarah screamed into the comms. "I need a way to shut it down now." "We're on it," Grayson replied urgently. "But we can't do anything unless we get to the main control room. The central core's too far gone to fix from your end." "Then we'll have to stop it ourselves," Sarah said, her voice resolute. She glanced back at Viper, who was still grinning, oblivious to the impending destruction. His smugness only fueled her rage. "Enough of this," she muttered to herself. She moved toward the weapons locker, grabbing a combat knife. The energy in the chamber was growing more violent by the second. Viper noticed her movement and shouted, "What do you think you're going to do with that, Dr. Holt? You can't kill me, and you certainly can't stop the forge." Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she charged, using the knife to pry open a hidden access panel in the wall, exposing a secondary interface that bypassed the failed systems. She quickly hacked into it, using all the knowledge she had accumulated over months of study. The seconds stretched out into an eternity. Her mind worked at lightning speed, calculating risks, analyzing every possibility. She could feel the forge's power trying to break through, pressing against her as though it could sense her actions. "Grayson," she muttered under her breath, "I hope you're ready." With one final push, the interface accepted her command. A system override initiated, but it was too late to fully contain the forge's power. The chamber quaked once more, and for a moment everything seemed to pause, the energy swirling in the air, the chaos outside the forged chamber, Viper's cold laugh, all of it hanging in suspended animation. Then, with an ear-splitting roar, the forge's power reached a crescendo, and the room was consumed by an explosion of light. Everything went black. Sarah's vision swam in a sea of darkness. Her ears rang with the faintest echoes of an explosion, but the sound quickly faded. Her body ached, her head spinning, as she struggled to regain consciousness. She could feel the cold metal of the floor beneath her, the sharp sting of the air as it rushed past her, like a gust from an approaching storm. A slow groan escaped her lips as she pushed herself up, her muscles protesting the movement. The forge, the explosion, it had happened so fast. For a moment, she was unsure if she was still alive, unsure if the blast had destroyed everything she had worked for. But then her senses began to sharpen. The familiar hum of machinery, faint and distant, reached her ears. It was a low thrum, as though something was still alive within the depths of the forge, something far more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. The forge had reacted to her command, but at what cost? "Sarah." The voice was faint but unmistakable. "Grayson." She turned toward the sound, her mind desperately trying to piece together the fractured thoughts. She squinted through the haze, her eyes catching the flicker of movement in the distance. Grayson was kneeling, his hand pressed to the floor as he struggled to stand. His face was bruised, his uniform torn, but he was alive. "Grayson," she gasped, her heart skipping a beat in relief. "Are you?" "I'm good. For now," he interrupted, struggling to his feet with her help. "But we've got bigger problems. The Forge. It's not just a weapon. It's a power source, and right now, it's consuming everything around us." Sarah's mind reeled as she processed his words. The Forge had always been more than just a weapon, something designed to harness unimaginable energy, but to use that energy to reshape the galaxy itself. It was far beyond anything she had anticipated. It was alive now, in a way no one could understand. "We need to stop it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest. "Before it consumes everything." Grayson nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the chamber. The walls were cracked, and smoke filled the air. But it wasn't just the room that had changed. Sarah could feel it in the air, an oppressive presence, as if the Forge had become sentient, aware of their every move. "We're not the only ones here," Grayson muttered, his eyes narrowing as he observed something in the distance. "Viper. He's still alive." Sarah followed his gaze. Through the haze, she could see a figure slowly rising from the rubble. Viper, blood-eyed and battered, but unmistakably alive. His movements were sluggish, his body weighed down by the force of the blast, yet there was a dangerous glint in his eyes, one that sent a chill down her spine. "You should have joined us, Dr. Holt." Viper's voice was hoarse, but steady as he staggered toward them, his fingers twitching at his side. "The Forge doesn't belong to you. It never did. It belongs to those with the strength to control it." Sarah's blood ran cold. His words struck a nerve. Viper had always seen power as something to be seized, something to be wielded by those with the will to dominate. But now, with the Forge's energy surging out of control, she knew he wasn't just after control. He wanted to possess the Forge's power for himself. "You're too late," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "The Forge is already alive, and it won't listen to you." Viper's lips curled into a smile, blood dripping down his chin. "You think so? Then why is it responding to me?" Before Sarah could react, a crackling energy field erupted around Viper, a sickly green light pulsating from his outstretched hands. The Forge's energy was swirling around him, feeding into the madness that was slowly consuming his mind. It was a dangerous game now. Sarah understood the stakes clearer than ever. The Forge wasn't just a weapon, but a force of nature, one that had no concept of good or evil, only power. "Grayson," she shouted, pushing him back. "We need to stop him. Now." Grayson raised his rifle, but Sarah saw the hesitation in his eyes. It wasn't just Viper that was dangerous now, it was the Forge itself. If they attacked him, there was no telling how the Forge would react. "Get back," Sarah shouted. "We have to cut the power first. If we don't, we're all dead." Grayson hesitated for a split second longer, then nodded. "You're right, but we need to act fast." Together, they moved toward the central control panel, the pulse of energy growing stronger with each step. The walls trembled as the Forge, in its new form, pushed against the world around it, threatening to consume everything in its wake. And in the midst of the chaos, Viper's laughter echoed through the room, cruel and hollow. "You can't stop it. The Forge is already mine. Soon, the galaxy will bend to my will." But Sarah had other plans. She wasn't going to let him, or the Forge, destroy everything they had fought for. The control room was nothing like Sarah remembered. Where once there had been sleek terminals and efficient systems, now there was a chaotic mess of fractured technology, sparking cables, and jagged metal. The Forge's energy had left the entire facility in ruins, and Sarah could feel the overwhelming power coursing through the air, as if the room itself had become an extension of the forge's rage. Grayson was at the main console, his fingers dancing across the keyboard, trying to bypass the failsafes Viper had activated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. He was close, she could tell. But it wouldn't be enough unless they acted fast. The forge's energy was growing unstable, threatening to tear the facility apart. Sarah's gaze flickered back to Viper. His wild eyes glinted with malevolent delight as he stood in the center of the room, his hands glowing with the sickly green energy. The forge pulsed around him, as if feeding off his very being, heightening his power. "You think you can stop me?" Viper sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I control the forge now. There's no shutting it down, no escaping it. You've already failed." Sarah tightened her grip on the rifle she had pulled from the weapons locker, her heart racing. The air was thick with tension. Viper was too dangerous now, far more than any mercenary she had ever faced. And if she didn't act quickly, everything they had worked for, everything they had fought to protect, would be lost. Grayson's voice cut through the tension. "I'm almost there, but it's going to take a few more seconds. Keep him distracted." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she took aim at Viper. She couldn't afford to hesitate. The energy field around him flickered and surged, as if responding to her thoughts. Without warning, she fired. The shot rang out, striking the floor just inches from Viper's feet. The blast sent a shockwave through the room, knocking Viper back a step, but he was unfazed. His laughter echoed off the walls. "You think a mere bullet can stop me?" he taunted, raising his hand to deflect the blast of energy that surged toward her. But this time, Sarah was ready. She darted behind a fallen piece of machinery for cover, narrowly avoiding the deadly burst of energy. Grayson cursed under his breath. "This is insane. We need to. Shut it down now." Sarah shouted over the roar of the forge, "Before it's too late." Viper grinned, his eyes alight with madness. "You think you have control. You've given me everything I need to reshape the galaxy. I'll be the one to decide who lives, who dies. The forge is mine, and I'll use it to break the universe itself." Sarah's mind raced as she assessed the situation. Viper wasn't just after power. He was consumed by it, willing to burn everything to the ground. And with the forge's power coursing through him, he was more dangerous than ever. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up just yet. She glanced back at Grayson, who was still frantically working to hack into the main system. Time was running out. The forge's energy was pulsating faster now, like a heartbeat growing ever more erratic. Every second that passed brought them closer to disaster. "Grayson, hurry," Sarah urged, her voice sharp. "He's not going to stop until everything's gone. We need to take him down, now." Grayson didn't respond. His face was etched with frustration as his fingers moved faster across the console. He was so close. They both knew it. Viper's energy field crackled, sending arcs of power spiraling around him like a storm. His eyes locked onto Sarah, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think you can stop me?" he repeated, his voice low and filled with malice. "The forge belongs to me, and when I'm done, nothing will be left but dust." But Sarah wasn't about to let him win. With a steady hand, she raised the rifle again and fired, this time aiming for the control panel at Viper's side. The blast struck true, and the explosion sent a surge of energy through the room, causing Viper to stagger. For a moment, the forge's energy flickered, as though its connection to Viper had been momentarily disrupted. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance. "Grayson," she shouted. "Now." With a final desperate effort, Grayson slammed his hand down on the console. The system beeped loudly, and the energy in the room seemed to pulse once more, then began to dissipate. Viper let out a scream of rage as the energy field around him flickered and collapsed. He stumbled backward, his hands grasping at the air as if trying to hold on to the forge's power, but it was slipping away, falling from his grasp. "No, this isn't possible." Viper howled, his voice filled with disbelief and fury. "I was supposed to be the one." Sarah and Grayson exchanged a brief look. The forge was still alive, but it was no longer under Viper's control. The room was no longer pulsing with energy, and the power that had once threatened to destroy them all now seemed to recede, as though recognizing the shift in balance. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Viper was still a threat, and the forge's power, though contained for now, could still unleash chaos if they didn't find a way to neutralize it once and for all. Sarah raised her rifle again, her eyes steely with determination. "It's not over, Viper. Not by a long shot." And with that, the final confrontation began. Viper's eyes burned with fury, his once calm demeanor shattered. The forge's energy was slipping through his fingers, and the realization that he was no longer in control twisted his expression into one of primal rage. "No, this isn't how it's supposed to end," he roared, his voice echoing through the ruined chamber. The forge pulsed once more, erratic and unstable, its power shifting like a storm brewing on the horizon. Despite the temporary collapse of Viper's control, the forge was still a force of nature, and it wasn't going to stop until it had fully reset its course. Sarah tightened her grip on her rifle, eyes locked on the man who had once been her ally. The desperation in Viper's face told her all she needed to know. He was no longer thinking clearly. His obsession with the forge had consumed him entirely, leaving nothing but a broken shell of the man who had once been driven by ambition. "We can still stop this," Sarah said, her voice firm, though the weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. "But only if you let go of it, Viper. It's too much for any one person to control." Viper's lips curled into a cruel sneer, and with a sudden, violent gesture, he unleashed a burst of energy, sending a shockwave that shook the very foundation of the forge. The walls trembled, and sparks flew from the control panels. It was as though the forge was amplifying his rage, reacting to his every movement. "You think you can lecture me? You don't understand." Viper spat, his eyes wild. "The forge isn't a tool, it's a weapon, a catalyst for reshaping everything. If you won't join me, then you'll be the first to witness its true power." Before Sarah could react, Viper unleashed another blast, sending her flying backward, slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. The breath was knocked from her lungs, but she forced herself to stay conscious. She couldn't afford to lose focus now. Grayson's voice cut through the haze of pain. "Sarah, are you okay?" She groaned but pushed herself up, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through her body. Her mind was clear. Viper had already shown them what he was capable of, and now it was time to finish it. "I'm fine," she said, forcing herself to stand. She took a deep breath, steadying her pulse. "We need to get to the core control center. That's where we can shut this down for good." Grayson nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need to be careful. Viper's not done yet." The ground beneath their feet rumbled again, the forge responding to the chaos in the room. Its core was unstable, thrumming with energy as it continued to channel power in all directions. Each pulse felt like a countdown to destruction. They didn't have much time. Together, Sarah and Grayson moved toward the central control platform. Their path was blocked by debris, and each step felt like they were walking through a field of jagged glass. But they pushed forward. They had no choice. Behind them, Viper laughed, an unsettling, hollow sound. "You're wasting your time," he called, his voice dark. "The forge will never be stopped." "And neither will I." Sarah glanced over her shoulder. Viper was moving toward them, his hands glowing with that sickly green energy. His face was twisted in an expression of maddened victory. But it was clear to Sarah that he was spiraling into madness. The forge was not just a tool, it had become his prison. They reached the control center, and Grayson immediately went to work on the terminal. His fingers moved with rapid precision, bypassing Viper's lockdown codes and finding the fail-safes. But the system was like a living thing, shifting with every attempt to hack it, as if the forge was resisting the shutdown. Sarah's heart pounded as she kept her eyes on Viper. He was getting closer. They didn't have much time. "Grayson, hurry," she urged, her voice tight with urgency. "I'm trying." Grayson grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "This thing's designed to fight back. The forge doesn't want to be shut down." As if on cue, the entire facility trembled. The lights flickered, and the walls began to crack under the strain of the energy being funneled through them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The forge wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was becoming a cataclysm. Viper raised his hands. His eyes locked on Sarah and Grayson with madness burning behind them. "You can't stop it. The forge is the future. It's more powerful than anything you can imagine." A powerful blast of energy erupted from his palms, forcing Sarah and Grayson to dive for cover. The explosion sent shockwaves through the control room, knocking Grayson to the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she assessed their situation. The energy pulses were becoming more frequent, more violent. The forge wasn't just a weapon. It was now an unstable entity, with its power growing out of control. Every second they delayed was another second closer to total destruction. Grayson reached for a small device on his belt, a last-ditch effort to counteract the forge's volatile energy. "I've got an idea," he said, his voice strained. "But I'll need you to keep Viper distracted." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Viper as he closed in on them. "Just make it work, Grayson." With one last look at her, Grayson activated the device, and the hum of energy around them shifted. It was the beginning of the end. The room was a battleground. The forge's energy had reached a critical level, its pulsations growing more frantic by the second. Every surface in the room seemed to vibrate with power, as though the entire facility was on the brink of collapse. Sarah could feel the tension, thick and suffocating, in the air. She glanced at Grayson, who was struggling with the device, his fingers trembling as he tried to align the signals. Viper was approaching, his eyes wild, his hands crackling with energy that seemed to warp the very air around him. He was no longer just a man. The forge had consumed him, transformed him into something far worse, a conduit for its raw, unrestrained power. "You think you can stop this?" "It's too late," Viper spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The forge is beyond control now. I'm its master. I am the forge." Sarah could see the madness in his eyes, but there was also something more. Fear. The energy that had granted him power was unstable, and even he knew that it could consume him just as easily as it had made him. He was on the edge, and the only thing that kept him moving forward was his desperation to hold on to that power. She didn't hesitate. With a quick movement, Sarah raised her rifle and aimed directly at Viper. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but her mind raced. This wasn't just about defeating him anymore. The forge had to be stopped, or the galaxy would be torn apart. "Grayson," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. I can't hold him off forever. We need to act now. Grayson's face was pale with exertion, sweat dripping down his brow, but his eyes were locked onto the device in his hands. The air around them seemed to hum, crackling with energy as he adjusted the final settings. He had just one chance to make it work. Almost there. Just a few more seconds. Grayson grunted, his voice strained. The forge's energy is going into overdrive. If I don't redirect the power, we're all going to be vaporized. Sarah's eyes flicked back to Viper. He was closing in. The air around him crackled with raw energy, and he moved with terrifying speed, sending arcs of power crashing toward her. Sarah dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast, but the shockwave sent her skidding across the floor, her gun slipping from her hands. Viper laughed, the sound like a crazed maniac's final victory. You can't run forever. It's already too late for you. You should have joined me when you had the chance. But Sarah didn't panic. She pushed herself up, eyes locking onto the glowing core of the forge, its power flooding the room, and then back at Grayson, who was on the verge of completing his task. One more shot. That's all they needed. With a grunt of effort, Grayson activated the device. The humming around them reached a fever pitch, and a blinding pulse of light erupted from the core. Viper's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. The energy was redirecting, funneling into a controlled stream that began to sever the connection between Viper and the forge. The shockwave sent him flying back, his body convulsing as he screamed in agony. "No," Viper howled, his voice breaking. "You can't. Do this." The power around them flickered as the forge's energy began to collapse inward, its once turbulent flow now being contained by the device Grayson had activated. The ground shook violently, and for a moment it felt as though the very foundations of the facility were crumbling beneath them. But then the chaos stopped. Everything fell silent. The pulsations of energy slowed and then ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of labored breathing. Sarah was on her feet in an instant, her heart racing as she looked around the now still room. Grayson stood beside the control panel, staring at the now dormant device. The forge's power had been contained, neutralized, and its destructive potential stripped away. Viper lay on the ground, unconscious and twitching. The energy had drained from him as well. He was no longer the powerful figure he had once been, just a shadow of his former self. His obsession with the forge had brought him to the edge of madness, and, ultimately, to his fall. Sarah walked over to him, her steps slow but purposeful. She didn't raise her weapon. She didn't need to. Viper was no longer a threat, and whatever justice he deserved would come later. "Is it over?" Grayson asked, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. Sarah nodded, her eyes still locked on the unconscious form of Viper. For now. They both stood in silence for a moment, taking in the destruction, the quiet that followed the storm. The forge, once a force capable of unimaginable power, was nothing more than a dormant relic. Its energy was no longer a threat, and the galaxy was safe, for the time being. But Sarah knew this was just one victory in a larger war. There would be other challenges, other forces seeking to control the unimaginable power the forge had held. Yet they had proven that humanity could rise above even the greatest threats. "The future's still ours," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We just have to keep fighting for it." Grayson gave her a small, weary smile. "Yeah, we will." As the two of them made their way toward the exit, leaving the ruined facility behind, they knew that this victory would resonate across the galaxy. The Forge had been defeated, and with it, a new chapter in humanity's struggle had begun, one where they would never back down from the impossible. And with that, The legacy of the Eternal Forge was sealed, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a symbol of humanity's indomitable will to protect what mattered most.